for the Los Angeles Master Chorale. And one of the pieces they performed was called Time and Our Voices. And it was a choral work that was mixed with audio tracks of interviews from children, teenagers, adults, and then elders, all about time. They were asked to respond to questions about time. And it was interesting to hear the voices of people talk about time, from the little child who says, time is just a bunch of numbers, to some of the elderly speaking about how time is slowing down and be able to be aware of it, and the richness of all of that. And in our first reading, St. Paul is writing to us saying, behold, now is a very acceptable time. I think in some ways, throughout our lives, we seem to wait and say, okay, well, as soon as this happens, then I can do this for God, or as soon as I learn enough about this, then I can do something. And that's not really the attitude of the disciple. There was a word in Greek for not like the measured time, but for these opportune moments where God calls, and calls us to be responsive. There's a particular word for that, kind of like the key moment, like a blacksmith who knows just when the right moment is to strike the hot iron with the hammer to shape the metal. And that word described the attitude of the disciple, to be ready to hear the call of the Lord, to answer and be responsive to that. And St. Ignatius would call that discernment, that sense of that discernment. And so Paul, as he's writing to these Corinthians, is talking to them about that need to be able to be responsive, to know when the Spirit is calling. And St. Thomas wrote a commentary, a very extensive and detailed commentary. But there is something he shared in that commentary that I think could be helpful for us. He said there are 4 virtues that St. Paul is writing about in this passage. And it chastity, knowledge, hope, and charity. He said this passage talks about these virtues to assist us. He says, we cannot be truthful persons if we first do not seek to be chaste, to purify ourselves, to be single-hearted and single-minded on the Lord. And some may say, well, Father, I'm not a priest or religious, and there's a chastity that all of us can live, no matter what our state in life. Which means we're focused on the Lord and the Lord's presence and what the Lord wants. And we purify our motives and our lives to conform ourselves to that. So that's that one virtue of chastity. Of knowledge. And I think this, what St. Thomas Aquinas described as knowledge, that virtue in this particular instance, is a lot like what St. Ignatius would talk about discernment. He says knowledge about what the Lord is asking, or knowledge of the Lord's movement, knowledge of what God is doing. And it's that sense of being attuned to God's Spirit. And then he says hope. Hope is made by long suffering, by enduring many hardships. If we think that we can get through this Christian life without having to endure a lot of hardships, boy, we've got news for you. No, to be a follower of Jesus, to be a disciple of Jesus, means to endure many hardships, but not simply to resist them or endure them, but to do so with a sense that God is bringing about something good, that something good ultimately is going to happen through all of this. And not only in my own life, but by enduring things, that I might bring about something good and fruitful in others around me, that they might see and be encouraged to not only endure their hardships, but that perhaps what is happening in my life might be of some good to them. And then finally, charity. We cannot do any of these things without a desire to see the good in others, to benefit others, to share with what we've been given to others. And so St. Thomas reminds us that ultimately all of this is meant to move us out of ourselves and into helping someone else know the path of grace and goodness. And Jesus was teaching his disciples the same in the gospel today. He says, don't be concerned with all this. Be concerned with what is good for your neighbor. Be concerned with doing what is right. and there we shall prove ourselves to be trustworthy, that our message, not our message, but the message of Jesus, might resound with that clarity of truthfulness, might resound with that charity and that mercy that God has for all of his creation, and that those who may be skeptical might still hear God's call.